for those of you that didn't notice, Jamie is currently a Liberal Democrat, but it'll probably have changed by the end of the debate. And now we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Cal. So,
suppose that Hobbes over there is right. Suppose that anarchy was the original state, the state of nature. Imagine if somebody in this war of all against all said, you know, I will be the arbiter between, you know, mutually between all of you and also between you and myself. Like, nobody would accept that. People would think they were crazy. So I don't think society agrees that, well, I don't think society that exists before the state, or that hasn't already been brainwashed to believe that the state is a good thing, would ever come up with the idea of a state. I also dispute his idea that the state is society. I think that's really messed up. Like, society is voluntary association. Society is where, in our mutual dealings, I benefit and you feel like you've benefited as well. The state is a situation. The state is a situation where one person is benefiting at the expense of another. But actually, everybody feels like they're benefiting, that everybody feels like they're benefiting at the expense of another. And I think that's pretty messed up as well. Personally, I don't feel like I'm benefiting, though.
Information?
No, thank you. Okay, so anarchy is an anomy. Anomy is the state of no law. Anarchy is the state of no state, of no enforcer. No monopoly enforcer of law. I think that's the fundamental problem, is that they want a monopoly, and I don't. I think monopoly is inefficient, and here's why. They don't have price information. This is the economic point, basically. Profits and losses are signals. Without profits and losses, the state will over and under provide certain services according to political and therefore inefficient incentives. So, for example, they might believe, without the right price information, that a hospital needs to be built. But if that hospital ends up being unprofitable, they have no way of knowing whether it was really a good way to use those resources and serve those consumers or not. When you ask a state department to cut their budget, they cut the most important services in that department to show how vital their work is. Businesses cut the irrelevant marginal costs, and isn't that what you should be doing?
Yeah, I want to take you back to this idea that price signals. What price signal does your wonderful market send to somebody in a wheelchair? How do they get valued without the protective hand of government?
Well, it's quite interesting, isn't it? The state is the abdication of personal responsibility. We've just seen it. He says we should do something. But, you know, we should do something about this person in a wheelchair who can't help themselves. But no, that actually means the state should do something, rather than, you know, how can I help? What can I do? I believe in private charity. I don't think that it's charitable to take somebody else's money and give it to somebody that you feel needs it. I think you should be reaching into your own pocket to help those people. And actually, I think the state hurts them in a more peripheral way also by creating minimum wage legislation, which is basically compulsory unemployment. They can't get employed because their work isn't worth it. I think that's absolutely disgusting, no thank you. Mandatory unemployment is just wrong. Employment legislation and regulations keep the poor poor, and they kill small entrepreneurship that should be creating jobs to help people help themselves. Furthermore, the state controls the money supply, thereby robbing us through inflation and by causing business cycles. It sets interest rates, which should be a price that coordinates saving and spending over time, but they're not able to fulfill that crucial function because they're interfered into by the state. So we malinvest and destroy important resources that should be more properly allocated through time, and that's why we get business cycles, and we see the destruction all around us. Now, finally, on to the problem of politics. Now, we actually learned this in politics lessons, so Mr. Endersby can doze off for a moment. Democracy is no safeguard against tyranny. People vote for various reasons. For self-interest, trying to plunder each other through the organ of the state. Tribally, because of, you know, ideological reasons, because, you know, your dad voted Labour or whatever. Because we have you can have a referendum kind of thing on the previous government, where you're retrospectively voting on whether or not the previous government was doing the right thing. But these things cannot all be expressed through a single vote, particularly not in a 3- or 4-party system. So, say, for example, you are a lefty, but you think the present lefty parties are pretty rubbish. What are you going to do? Start your own party? Good luck with that. Also, rational ignorance means that people don't have the incentive to become an informed voter. Why should I figure out which party is the right one for the country if it doesn't actually pay off for me because my vote is only one of, 30 million or whatever? I don't have any incentive to do that, so I'm not going to vote very well. I'm not going to inform myself. Democracy is that great fiction by which everyone seeks to benefit at everyone else's expense. And I'll leave you with that Bastiat quote, and I will see you in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Well, at least we've learned that Jamie and Cal agree on one thing, and that's that there aren't enough political parties in our current system. But now we move on to Ollie, who, if he does stand for one thing, it is that we can do whatever we like in the bedroom. So please go.
Whilst perhaps not sexually conservative, and I'll leave it for you to decide whether or not I'm handsome, I am certainly not free. Ladies and gentlemen, Cal's case relies on this fact that people have this inherent freedom and which the state takes away. Well, firstly, this is what most of my rebuttal will focus about, and then going to go on to my constructive case, which is roughly divided into 2 parts. This is that people, because Cal's case rests on the fact that people, it's better for them to not be a state than it is to be a state, and secondly, that we can actually plausibly achieve a state. Now this is, that is a stateless society from where we are currently. It's the second part of that Jamie has to some extent already addressed. I wish to go over this again with some new content. Jamie addressed it fantastically. And then the last part of my speech will be dedicated to why we have an obligation to look after others. Right, rebuttal. Cal argued that people would never accept this arbiter who would rule over them in, an anarchical, if we all started off in an anarchical state. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all bound by the laws of physics. We are all bound by certain things. We are bound by the laws of nature. So let's tie this in with what he later said about his wheelchair advantage, and he started off his speech, taxation is theft. Ladies and gentlemen, I would happily steal from Cal, or indeed any person in this room, I would happily steal from them in order to help someone who was starving. I have absolutely no problem with that whatsoever, because if someone starves because you do not give them money, that is exactly the same as you stealing from them. Sure, right, yeah. On to my main point. There will always be a state. This is because people enjoy forcing themselves upon others.
More that sexual influence again.
Exactly. People enjoy forcing themselves upon others. Sorry? Anyway. For us, if you do not have a state, what is simply going to happen is that power will be simply distributed as would be naturally. I.e., those who are the richest, who have the most resources, will be able to force themselves upon others. With the state, by sure we're having... Yes, please.
Is the state not the perfect organ through which the strong can exploit the weak?
Absolutely not, because had he studied Tudor history, my opponent right over there, he would have realised that ultimately a significant amount of power does lie within the people, does lie within the minorities, but only when they get together, only when they form a group. By everyone forming into one group, this is the perfect manner in which people can exact force upon others, and we can reach this equilibrium in which it doesn't matter whether you're simply incredibly rich. Like, sure, it's always going, like, if you're... yes.
Yeah, but some people will be more involved and more able to use that organ than the rest of us, and that's how they dominate us and control us.
At very best, what Cal has given us is a slightly different scenario in which the power is... So Cal says you have this choice in which either the richest have the most power, or else, like the people who are the most with the state have the most power. Well, we personally believe that actually by putting it in the context of a state, by having the power distributed in the context of a society which binds itself to certain principles, to certain laws, as we have in the UK, what happens is that whilst people do indeed have power, sure, the Prime Minister's more powerful than me, sure, he has the right to exert some force on me, that's ultimately... Yeah, alright, go away. Whilst he does have these powers, he is held to a greater sense of account than were he simply incredibly rich and owned like a plantation or something, and there were no state in which power was distributed. So that's why there always will be a state. Ladies and gentlemen, people such as myself, some of you may have done babysitting, and you will have realized that children are really damn stupid. Like children, Jesus Christ, they will do the most stupid things ever. Ladies and gentlemen, people need to be looked after. This is just a fact of life. You need to impose authority upon children. You need to do this, or they are going to kill themselves by the time they are like 5. Anyone who has any experience with the real world, can you please shut up? Anyone who has any experience with the real world realizes that this is an occasional. You're out of time. Anyone who has any experience with the real world realizes that this is a necessity. And ladies and gentlemen, this is true in many walks of life. For instance, those who are disabled, those who have mental disabilities. These are people with mental disabilities are a thing.
Mentality, ladies
and gentlemen, we have to step in to help these people. We have to steal from some people in the form of tax, but we personally, as side opposition, think that it's acceptable. In fact, it would be absolutely condemnable were we not to steal and instead to allow those who we have a burden to look after. So Jesus Christ. Ladies and gentlemen, please look after the poor. Thank you.
I was really worried where that children in London was going to go. But now we have time for a floor speech, and I really don't know if you're trying to prove a point, but we are keeping to time incredibly well. So we have plenty of time for anybody to explain to, if they can, what Cal's been trying to say. So anybody who does understand, who has any points for the proposition?
I'm not saying I understand, but I've got a point. Okay, I kind of wanted to address what the opposition's case, what I think the opposition's case has been about so far. And that kind of rests on how minorities fare in an area, which I'm not going to define as a civilization, but just an area, a collective area in which they live around other people who are the majority. And the opposition's case seems to rest on the fact that the state is really good at looking after minorities. And while this might be the case sometimes, in some respects, to some minorities, this isn't always the case. And actually, a lot of the time, the way in which states try to look after their minorities is actually actively harmful to these minorities. So, for example, you look at people who are, I don't know, the victims of sexual attacks or robbery, people who are the victims of crimes by another member of that society. Quite often, they end up just being exploited as a function of the state, exploited by the police, the judicial procedures of the state. And the state is no longer good at looking after the minorities, which is what the only thing so far that the opposition have said that the state is good at. If the state is not very good at doing that, then the state doesn't really seem to stand for anything in the opposition's view, so I can't really side with the opposition over this. And if you look at the way that minorities are kind of treated, the way the minorities are attempted to be looked after, minorities end up just being sort of swallowed up by this system. You have rape victims who are just swallowed up by this system of so-called judicial review or so-called police procedures. They just get swallowed up and they are abused even further. So I can't see how the state is good at doing what the opposition says it's good at doing. And secondly, I also would never allow my children to be babysat by Holdsworth. And I'm sure Miss Endersby may or may not agree with that, being the only parent in the room here. So yeah, for both of those points, I'd like to side with Cal on this one.
Before we move on to the many points of the opposition, I thought we'd just give the children a vote. And Martin, would you like to be babysat by Holdsworth?
I'm sorry, Martin, we have 7 rather.
Well, now I'm just confused.
That's probably how you feel at the end of that as well.
My babysitting considered.
So, who has a point for the opposition? We'll start with Graham.
I just have a quick question for Cal, but first, I think the word is anarchic, not anarchistical.
Or anarchical.
So if you could use that word in your speech, Mr. Endersby, that would be very nice. Might save you some time. But Cal, just one simple question: if there were no government, who would build the roads?
Yes!
Any more points for the proposition? Joe?
This is just building on Holsey's point on how people need to be looked after. Sure, yes, children under the 5 are bumbling idiots who do try to fall down the stairs as many times as they possibly can. I have 2 younger siblings, they do it all the time. But why should the state force themselves as their protectors of everyone else? Surely, if I decided I need a protector, I'd choose a close family relative or something to say, I don't know, I need protecting or something. Why should there be this giant, like, big brother who decide that we're going to be your protector, you have to pay us the money, which, with, like, the taxes and stuff, so we can protect you, when I would be quite happy paying a friend to do it, and actually more happy when they'd probably do a better job, personally.
Another point for the opposition. Tom.
I just had a question for Capp. I believe what you're saying about people being protected was in the way that you would, like, as such, get with your friends, and then to protect yourself, which, yes, in a way forces you to be nice, but how would you stop that from people going into little groups, then the little groups merging and just forming a government anyway?
And now I have a point from the man who, I quote, is just like Cal because I sit at home doing nothing but reading economics. So let's have a point from Gabriel.
As possibly the only person here who's prepared to kid themselves that they understand what Cal's talking about.
Including Cal.
Yeah. Something that the opposition haven't touched on at all, and that Cal has to an extent, is how ineffective, or inefficient rather, the state as a body is. So, like, look at the moment, you have massive wastages through, stupid contracts that weren't thought out in the first place to things like hospitals. It hasn't worked. To take the example of building roads, a lot of roads have potholes, but they do nothing about it. So what happens if you don't have a state and you start giving private contract or companies rather start doing this on their own? Is that it's worth something to people to not have potholes in their roads?
Side opposition, because we either take 5 steps back and then 5 steps forwards to where we are today, or we move forward and develop the state, make it more efficient, and give people more freedoms using the state that we have. Thank you.
Have we got any more points for the proposition? Tom, we already had a point.
Am I allowed to make another?
Yes, we can.
Okay. This is, again, kind of almost repeating what I said before, but it's, if there is a way that you don't have to take 5 steps back, you can either move this state forwards, or you can change it and move that forwards. It's like with communism, there are different types of it. There are different types of anarchy. There's the anarchy that we had way before, or you could develop that and you could take what we've learned from that and make a better version. So if there is a way to stop us from doing what you and I said and turning into where we are now again, then you can still bring it up and forwards.